Hello, friends. Jonathan Rogers here. Before we hear from Malcolm Guite and Junius Johnson, I wanted to let you know that I'm giving away a free mini course to help you get started on a new writing project. This content was originally part of the Habits Writer Development cohorts, but I'm giving it away this holiday season as a way to help people face some of the greatest challenges involved in pushing past inertia and getting words on the page. You can get this mini course by going to thehabit.co/development. Go to thehabit.co/development, enter your email address, and you'll start getting a series of 3 lectures. After you go through it, I want to hear from you. What helped you? Did you have any breakthroughs in your creative process? We'll be kicking off our next writer development cohort mid-January 2026. I'll have more information on that for you soon. For now, go to thehabit.co/development.
So taking up the tale, it's a tale the land still holds. It's still calling out to you. The heavens are still declaring the glory of God. And if we would only turn and speak the tale forth again, it would do that work of opening eyes and ears. First our own, first the poet's, who has to listen before he speaks. But then all of those to whom the poet speaks, and that power is completed when I, listening to your poetry, have gained the power to take that tale forward and tell it to my children and tell it to another generation.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Galahad and the Grail is Book 1 of Merlin's Isle, Malcolm Guite's retelling of the King Arthur legends in ballad form. It's coming out in March of 2026. In the prelude to Galahad and the Grail, a voice shimmering in the morning air, a muse, a fairy, says, "Poet, take up the tale. Take up the tale the land still keeps. In earth and water magic sleeps. The dryad sighs, the naiad weeps, but you can lift the veil." Malcolm has taken up a very old tale and lifted the veil on stories that have lingered in the traditions of the British Isles longer than the English language itself. Scholar and teacher Junius Johnson is taking up the tale in another way. Starting in January 2026, Junius is teaching a 20-week online class on the King Arthur legend. He describes the class as a chance to see for yourself why this story has fascinated the imagination for so many centuries. In this episode, Malcolm and Junius talk with me about how King Arthur rode into their lives and what these stories have meant to them. Malcolm Guite, Junius Johnson, I'm so happy to have you back, both of you back on the Habit Podcast. Welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, it's great to be here. I was glad that we were able to meet up in person at Hutchmoot.
Yes.
That was good because we hadn't met up in person for a while before that.
That's right.
That's right for me too. Yeah, I hadn't seen you in ages.
Yeah.
Well, here we are. And okay, so we're talking about taking up the tale. Malcolm is taking up the tale of the Arthurian stories, and Junius, in a different way, is taking up that tale. So I'd love to hear y'all both talk about where did your interest and your commitment, let's say, to Arthur come from? We'll start with you, Malcolm.
Well, I was very fortunate to hear these stories first from my mother. So I didn't have anybody else. I didn't see the Disney film of The Sword and the Stone or anything like that. We didn't have a TV. We were in Africa. But my mum had this immensely retentive memory and this huge fund of stories and poems, and I loved just being with her when she recited. She was also had done a degree in medieval history, so she actually knew the sources quite well. Yeah. So she told me when I was about 7 or 8, over quite a long time, maybe a couple of stories a week, I would beg for more Arthur, she told me the stories. And this was not a kind of sanitized or expurgated version. In fact, the thing that struck me most deeply, this would have been I would have been about 8. It would have been, say, 1965 or 66. We were in Zimbabwe. And my mum told me the story of the Dolorous Stroke, or the Dolorous Blow as it's known. I don't want to do too many plot spoilers for people, but this maybe is a really important thing to know. So this is the tragic event in which a knight called Balin, who's the host of a king in the Grail Castle, though Balin, to be fair on him, doesn't realize it's the Grail Castle, and he secretly brings a weapon to a dinner at which, a feast at which everybody is supposed to leave their weapons aside. So there's a breaking of the laws of hospitality, and he's trying to get vengeance on someone for perfectly good reasons, but he starts violence at the feast, and his sword breaks, and he's weaponless. And the king of the Grail Castle, pursues him, and he runs basically through the castle seeking a weapon. And my mother told me this so well, that he would go up these stairs, and then he'd hear a voice like the angels, and he'd hear a thunderclap, and he'd hear a warning saying, "Unclean man, man of sinful blood, come no further in." All these warnings, but he's got a guy with a sword chasing him. He hasn't got a weapon.
Yeah.
So he finally comes, of course, to the Grail Chapel, not knowing that that's what it is. And he sees the chalice on the altar. And above it, he sees hovering a spear from which drops of blood are continuously falling into the chalice. And again, all these voices say, "Come no further, you are a man of unclean lips." It's the whole Isaiah 6 thing, you're in the Holy of Holies here, you shouldn't be here. But of course, he rushes forward, he seizes the spear, and he turns around, and he wounds the king, who is the Fisher King, the Grail King, in the thigh. And as soon as he does that, I remember my mother describing this as well, all that part of the castle falls in on them. It's a bit like sort of Barad-dûr coming down, except this is a good place, not a bad door. Something happens and the castle collapses. And they're buried under the rubble, both the king and Balin and the Grail, of course, for 3 days and 3 nights. And after 3 days, Merlin comes and by magic moves the stones. And when they emerge, Merlin tells Balin that the thing he has done is the dolorous stroke, that the spear was the spear that had pierced Christ's heart, that this spear was sacred, and that in a sense, that should have been the last wound any man ever gave another. That was where all the hatred stops and was meant to be. And he's desecrated it. And because he's wounded the king with this sacred thing, not only is the king wounded and his wound will not heal, but the land is wounded. The king and the land are kind of one. Yeah. And so he then has to ride out for 3. But finally Merlin says, the day will come when the good knight comes. The Grail Knight will come, and he will restore the spear, and he will use the same drops of blood from the spear that wounded the king to heal the king. And but that will be in the future. In the meanwhile, the land is utterly desolate. This is the wasteland. No good thing. This is where the wasteland comes from. That's where Eliot gets the title of his poem. The wasteland. And for 3 counties, nothing will grow. The fish are dead in the river. People can't conceive children. Cows can't calve. It's a complete devastation. And Balin has to ride through these 3 counties with everybody knowing that he did this and coming to their door and cursing him. And I can remember my mother telling me this, and I was, oh my goodness. And I remember I said to her, and this is a kind of key to why I still go back to these stories. I said to her, "Mum, that's terrible. That seems so unfair. He didn't really know what he was doing. Of course he shouldn't have done it, but how can one man's rash foolishness in just one gesture, one action, have such devastation for so many and for the very land itself? How could that even happen, Mum?" And my mum said to me, she looked me straight in the eye. She said, "I'm partly telling you this story because you need to know that you live in a world like that." And there'd just been a Cuban Missile Crisis. And she said, arrogant, rash men may just by a couple of gestures of their hand unleash this devastation on us. And we have to learn to live with that. But this story has hope that even the worst devastation can be healed. And she didn't do the full, look, I can tell you a little bit more about this and the sword will come across, and but she just let all these things happen. So the dolorous blow, and then the return of the Grail Knight, the achievement of the Grail, the healing of the king, the healing of the land, was a massive motif. And when I returned to it as a student, reading it in Mallory in the 70s, for me it spoke not so much about the immediate missile crisis, but about the growing ecological crisis. Now when I return to it again, it speaks to me about the whole problem of the immanent frame and the way we've made everything just dull and dead and flat and mechanistic and lost beautiful mutual courtesy and exchange that we used to have with nature, lost Barfield's original participation, as it were. So I realized from this lifelong of holding these stories I realized that these stories have always got more to teach, that the stories are older and wiser than we are. Anyway, my mum told me lots of the other stories. And when I played at Knights of the Round Table, which I did frequently, I always wanted to be Galahad. I knew I was never going to be Lancelot. Lancelot was the fit captain of the team, best boy in school kind of thing. I was never going to be that. But I was kind of a poet even then, and kind of a mystic in my own odd way. So actually Galahad was my guy.
Yeah.
Growing with and through Galahad and returning to those stories has been a long thread in my life. So once I decided I wanted to be a poet, I thought to myself, one day I will write this. But I've been putting it off for years and years and years, but now I'm finally undertaking it.
Yeah. Wow. I love that story of your mother. Not just...
Oh, and my mother is where all the poetry comes from. My mother and my grandmother. My grandmother was a Scottish poet, a published Scottish poet. And
is that right?
Wrote a wonderful cycle of poems about the Celtic saints. Published in 22, actually, the same year as The Wasteland.
Is that right? Junius, tell me about your history with the Arthur stories.
Yeah, my story is as much more prosaic than Malcolm's as my life is more prosaic than Malcolm's. And that is, growing up in the 80s in the United States, we were quite a lot of additional disenchantment had been happening since Malcolm's childhood that I was the heir of. I think the first time I ever heard mention of Arthur was probably when I was reading the Chronicles of Narnia for the first time.
Oh yeah, because it gets mentioned. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, and so there's the beginning of the Dawn Treader. The last time they'd come back to Narnia, it was as if King Arthur had suddenly come back to modern day Britain, as some say he will, and I say the sooner the better.
And I say the sooner the better.
Yeah, and I was like, what in the world is he on about, right? But not long after that, I did encounter the Disney film The Sword and the Stone. And it had a lot of things. So Narnia had trained me to the notion of knights and royalty as something beautiful and powerful, at least potentially so. And it trained me to the notions of chivalry and honor. Reepicheep had really captured my imagination and whatnot.
Well,
so all of that
is the good knight. When I reread The Voyage of the Dawn Treader after rereading the Arthurian stuff, there's all kinds of Arthurian things with Reepicheep as a kind of mousy Galahad.
Yes.
One who is the mystic. He's the one who will achieve the Grail as well. When they get to Aslan's table, which is a big feature, the Pauline Baines illustration has him standing and holding up a chalice. I mean,
yes.
It's all there.
Like a priest. Yeah, no, and it's funny because Reepicheep is he's like a Galahad who keeps straying into a Lancelot. He kind of loses his way multiple times, but that's another story. It's sort of be told another time. So for me, I was primed by the Chronicles and Lewis's own deep immersion in the Arthurian material for this. But then when I got to The Sword and the Stone, I saw, oh gosh, here's all this other stuff that I love. And it was grounded in this notion of this one boy who, against all odds, rips this sword out of his stone, the sword of destiny, and becomes the king. Now, I was growing up very poor in a very kind of hopeless social situation. Growing up in the inner city as an African-American kid in the South. And one of the things that I learned very quickly about the world around me was that it didn't offer the sorts of possibilities that I wanted. Right.
Yeah.
And so to me, right away, Arthur represented, by divine power, your life could be radically different than anything you might dare to even dream for yourself. When he first pulls that sword out in the Disney film, he can't comprehend what's going on. And it takes a long time for Merlin has to explain it to him very carefully. Well, I fell in love with that thing. And so I remember, back in the day, we had the Disney Channel, which was a whole channel devoted to just inculcating us and indoctrinating us with Disney lore. And they would send out this magazine once a month. And in the magazine, they would talk about the things that were going to be showing on the channel the coming month. And they would have a schedule. And there was one month when they were highlighting The Sword and the Stone, and they were going to be showing it a bunch of different times. And I went through and I marked every time that was going to be on. And I rearranged, I think it was the summer, I rearranged my whole day around when it was going to be on. And so in the course of that month, I probably watched it 17 or 18 times.
Wow.
This was back when, you couldn't stream stuff, obviously, and going to the video store to rent something, you could get something for a couple of days, and that was about it. So this was my way of, and I had agency, as I was too young to be renting anyway. I had agency to get this. And so I just soaked this thing up, memorized every word of it, and that was my first introduction to Arthur. And so, I think for much of my childhood, my heart and my longings were molded around this story. It didn't just represent the possibility of a way out. It represented what the nature of a better life should look like. It should be a life where there is adventure. It should be a life where people acting virtuously can make a difference, and where the weak can stand up for what's right and somehow become strong and change the nature of the world. So that was really how I first got into all of it.
That's brilliant. I mean, I didn't see the film, but I did read the book, The Sword in the Stone by T.H. White. Again, I was enchanted. The thing, I'm glad you mentioned the chivalry thing. That I didn't fully understand how important that was when I was a kid. But as I grew up and I studied history at school or whatever, and I began to see the appalling way armies in history have behaved.
Yeah.
Prisoners have been treated, especially the way women have been treated. And, I would go back to these Arthur stories. By that time, I had Roger Lancelin Green's wonderful telling, The Young Friend of C.S. Lewis. And I suddenly saw here, way, way back in the past, was an ideal that was better than we are now.
Yeah, that's right.
It just better, and that we needed that stuff. And now sometimes, as I grew up, I got, brilliant writer as he is, I got a little bit irritated with T.H. White because he's often making grown-up jokes and being ironic at the expense of the knights. Yes. He makes jousting is like the equivalent of hunting, shooting, and fishing. And some of his knights, Sir Egramore and, are basically bombastic English squires. Yeah. I didn't pick any of that satire up on the first read, but I picked it up on the second or the third, and it annoyed the hell out of me because I felt this story should be treated reverently. Yeah. I felt there was something luminous and numinous about it. And I've never liked readers who make wisecracks at the grown-ups across the faces of the children. Lewis never does that. Yeah. He writes fully and sincerely and perfectly for his child audience, sort of as a fellow child himself, but with massive narrative prowess. Yeah. So, that drove me. Well, the Roger Lancelin Green was a perfect antidote to that, and he's significant for my retelling now. But my mum must have carried on telling me those stories. I mean, well into the time when I could read for myself. I would, because she had a great narrative gift. So yeah, and gradually you have to be a bit older still to understand the tragedy of the Lancelot Guinevere Arthur thing. Yeah. And again, I was pretty amazed that was there in this book that everybody said was a classic and you were allowed to read. Yeah. Because these are things you actually have to wrestle with. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, I saw in this not only high adventure and surprise and romance, but I also saw basically a vision of how things ought to be. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Malcolm, you speak of a reverent treatment of the material. Your new retelling in ballad form of the story of the Galahad and the Grail is certainly a reverent treatment. Would you be willing to read the prologue to that? I think it might launch us into the next section.
This is a kind of prologue poem or proem, and it literally is. My method in writing, especially poetry, is that I tend to start outdoors in various bits of woodland, lovely woodland around here where I'm walking, and I get lines coming to me. And then in the olden days, I used to have to try and remember them all and then write them down when I got home. Nowadays, I sometimes dictate them to my phone, but nevertheless, I have them. I mean, Tennyson could do that 50 lines at a time. So this poem, which is about being out in the landscape, I actually composed out in the landscape. And the poem is voiced, as it were, for my muse. And it really did feel like a kind of gift. We've been talking a lot about Lewis, and he's so important for all of this. I'm sure Junius will also know and love the amazing Arthurian elements in that hideous strength. Yes. And Merlin appears. I always wanted Merlin to go around and reacquaint himself with the hedgerows. I was a bit sorry that Hanson frowned on that. But there's a follow-up conversation about a good haunting where one of the characters, Denniston, I think, says that what's something we may call Britain has always been haunted in a good way by something we may call logres. This is kind of inner spirit of what we should be. He says, we've dreamed better than we can do. And there's this kind of, he says, we're a nation of shopkeepers, but we're also, as Napoleon called us, but we're also a nation of poets. You know, we may have an ass's head, but we got it wandering in a fairy wood. So I began to feel that actually that England herself, or Britain herself, was carrying the story and was telling it to me. It was time. So here it is, just called Take Up the Tale. As I walked out one morning, all in the soft fine rain, it seemed as though a silver veil was shining over hill and vale, as though some lovely, long-lost spell had made all new again. And through that shimmer in the air, I seemed to hear a sound, as though a distant horn were blown in some lost land that I had known, that seemed to speak from tree and stone and echo all around. And with the music came these words, "Poet, take up the tale. Take up the tale this land still keeps. In earth and water magic sleeps. The dryad sighs, the naiad weeps, but you can lift the veil. From where the waves wash Cornwall's caves, out to the White Horse Vale, the lands still hold the tale of old. Like hidden treasure, buried gold. Once more the story must be told. Poet, take up the tale. Tell of the king who will return. Tell of the Holy Grail. Tell of old knights and chivalry. Tell of the pristine mystery of Merlin's Isle of Gramarye. Poet, take up the tale. Take up the tale of courtesy. Take up the tale of grace. Revive the land's long memory. Summon the fair folk. Let them be. Something of fairy, wild and free, still lingers in this place. Lift up your eyes to see the light on Glastonbury Tor. Then come down from that far green hill to where the sacred waters spill and shine within the chalice well, and listen to their lore. Yea, listen well before you start. Be still ere you begin. See through the surface round about, the noise, the rush, the fear, the doubt. Though modern Britain lies without, fair Logres lives within. You may yet walk through Merlin's Isle, by oak and ash and thorn. The ancient hills do not forget, and you might wake their wisdom yet. Who knows what wonders might be met on this midsummer morn? So I have taken up the tale, to tell it full and free, the tale that makes my heart rejoice. I tell it, for I have no choice. I tell it till another voice takes up the tale from me.
Love it, Malcolm. Thank you. And I love that idea of listening before you start, which appears elsewhere in your body of work.
Yeah, and I was very interested to hear Junius's lecture about fairy, as it were. What has Jerusalem to do with fairy, rather than Jerusalem to do with Athens? Because that's obviously a big theme for me. And I personally feel that the engagement with fairy is all to the good. Mm-hmm. The idea of the distinctiveness of fairy, that it's not part of our salvation story, but that it reminds us, it gives us glimmerings of the kind of wonder in the world. And there are lots of people, obviously Tolkien and George MacDonald, have thought quite a lot about how fairy and our world interact, and I see them very much interleaved. So you can step from one to the other, scarcely knowing you've done so until things start to happen,
Yeah.
So I don't know, you might want to talk more about your I'm saying, the muse is telling me include it, summon the fair folk, let them be, something of fair and free still lingers in this place.
Well, there's a couple of threads I'd love to riff on in that program, which I just love. I mean, I heard you read it for the first time at Hutchmoot, and I had been waiting to hear some text from this because I know your work and I know this saga, and the marriage of those two things to me was very exciting. And from the first couple of lines, I thought, I knew it. I knew this guy would nail it. It's exactly what I hoped for. And there's a couple of things that really stand out to me again, hearing you read it again now. You talk about the world as a place, England, Britain, if you will, as a place where there's an older world, which is a deeper layer of reality and truth that's there, that's been lost,
Mm.
and that's modernism. You know, all the good things have gone, and if we're really honest with ourselves, they were never more than dreams anyway. And so here we are, left with the rubbish of the ages and whatnot. But you talk about them as lost only to us, not as
Yes, exactly.
truly
They're
and
still
deeply
there.
lost,
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
yeah.
they're
Yeah,
still
that's the
there.
important. I mean, a lot of you and I will both know how much people are talking now all over the place about the notion of re-enchantment.
Mhm.
And in many ways, I find that a stirring and kindling idea. But I have a hesitation about the phrase simply because I don't think it's in our power to re-enchant. We're not the
Yeah,
singer who sings the cosmos into being. That's the Logos.
yeah,
He's the great enchanter in that sense. He chants the cosmos into being.
yeah.
I take the view that the world has never been disenchanted
Hmm.
itself, but we have lost the capacity to see it.
That's
So
right.
rather than trying to re-enchant the world, we need somehow to undisenchant ourselves.
That's right.
Yeah.
Disenchant ourselves. That's right. And so then, what I this notion of, all right, so that's there. Everything you've ever longed for is there. It's not gone
Mhm.
anywhere.
Mhm.
It reminds me of a joke that I heard. An old couple is driving. They've been married for 40 years, driving down the road. It's one of those old cars where there's a single bench for a front seat, and
Yeah.
the guy's driving, and the lady's sitting way over by the window. And she kind of sighs and she says, when we were younger and we drive along like this, we'd be snuggled up together. I'd be right up against you. You have your arm around me. What happened to us? And the guy, typical fashion, sort of shrugs and says, I haven't moved. And in many ways, that's the earth. That's the land. That's
Very
this
good.
wondrous world we're in. It hasn't moved. It hasn't
Yeah.
changed. It's all still there. But we have muted, right? The fairies have been driven underground, not by Christianity, but by a certain strange understanding, an austere Christianity that looks at the world in a particular sort of way and loses the
Yeah.
wild joy, the levity of God that Chesterton is so good at talking about, right? So
Yeah.
taking up the tale, it's a tale the land still holds. It's still
Yeah.
calling out to you. The heavens are still declaring the glory of God. And if we would
Yeah.
only turn and speak the tale forth again, it would do that work of opening eyes and ears. First our own, first the poet's, who has to listen before he speaks. But
Yeah.
then all of those to whom the poet speaks, and that power is completed when I, listening to your poetry, have gained the power to take that tale forward and tell it to my children and tell it to another
Yeah,
generation.
which is exactly actually how I end the thing with the kind of handing on.
Yeah.
That
Mhm.
in the second volume that's going to come out in the fall of next year, I've got a whole passage in which I think about poetry itself as one of the ways to undisenchant, one of the ways to see fairy or enter it again. And I have Arthur meet the sort of elven poet Taliesin.
Mm.
Obviously, I had to have Taliesin because I'm a Charles Williams fan, but my Taliesin is slightly different from his. But Taliesin, I have a scene where Arthur's given a small harp, and as he starts to sound his own small harp, he hears another harp answering it,
Mm.
and he follows the notes as the two sets, and then he meets the poet Taliesin, who is kind of poetry itself, and then they're able to lift the veil and step through into fairy, and there's various things that he needs to learn, including dealing with shadows and evil, but poetry is the way through. Yeah, the idea that you take up that you're enabled by reading the poetry to kind of renew the vision and then pass it on. So I have a kind of reply almost to the opening poem right up at the end. In my version of the story, Sir Bors, the three Grail Knights, Galahad, Percival, and Sir Bors. Sir Bors is the one who comes back.
Hmm.
Kind of my Sam Gamgee in various ways. He's the kind of humbler guy. Um, so maybe if I can read you just a few verses. Well, I'll read you the last three verses of the whole thing. This tale is not for us alone, but for our children too. So take the tale up if you can, and pass it on to maid and man, that it may grow like living grain, both beautiful and true. And so the tale, that's Board's last words.
Mm.
So the tale came down the years, in every land and tongue, and old folk told it through their tears, and gave it to the young. And even I, in these dark days, have heard and found it true. So I have taken up the tale and passed it on to you.
If I can riff on that a little bit deeper, I mean, this notion of taking up the tale. I'm a sort of outsider at this table because Malcolm is the poet who is called to sing the song, and I am in many ways just one of the front rank of listeners to that. Have a front row seat to that incredible show, but the thing that has meant a lot to me about this notion of taking up the tale, which has just really found a home in my intellectual landscape since I first heard you read those words a few months ago, is as a theologian and a teacher, that land of Britain that we're describing, which is haunted by logos, the logos that is its inner depth and its inner meaning, it's the truth of the thing.
Yeah,
that's the human heart first and foremost.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Right. And so this tale, and so the tale is the tale of who we are. I mean, there's a kind of the Arthurian story has traced out and etched out the contours of our souls like a river cutting through a landscape.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we're completely, it's like when the children in the Prince Caspian are trying to figure things out, and they're like, well, why is there this giant gorge here? There shouldn't be a gorge here at all. We're looking for the river. And it takes them some time to work out that the river over more than 1,000 years has carved the land in this way. We see the results of the tale, but we don't know what's done it anymore. And so my role as a teacher is to do what I can to help people recognize, no, all those grooves in your soul that drive so many of your hopes and your fears, this is where they came from. This is the river that echoes in you.
Yeah, that's a really good image. I think that's really helpful. Funnily enough, I wasn't sure where to read from, in those last three verses. Had I gone a little bit earlier, it would have said exactly what you just said about the heart. So I'll just read this. And good Sir Bors took out his harp, and he took up the tale of all our hopes and fears, the tale that passes down the years, the quest of joy, the quest of tears, quest of the Holy Grail. And some who heard it were transformed, changed from deep within. For in the lifting of the veil, they saw the love of God prevail, and likewise felt another veil lift from their hearts within. For this I know, said good Sir Bors, we saw the Grail depart, yet it did not depart from us, for lovely and mysterious its presence seemed to enter us. It shineth fair and glorious in the chapel of the heart.
So good. Readers, listeners, when you get this book in your hands, I'm going to go ahead and do a little teacher thing and give you one thing to look out for right away. Underline every time Malcolm uses the word veil. And pay attention to those passages.
Yeah. All right, Junius, tell me about your the way you are. I've lost the phrase.
Taking up the tale.
Thank you. Yes. Tell me, Junius, about how you're taking up the tale in your teaching.
Yeah. So one of the things that I did recently, I worked on this project of history textbooks for classical high schools based in primary sources. And I was tasked with doing the early medieval volumes, and then I also did a great deal of work on the later medieval volumes. But in those early medieval volumes especially, it's a task of trying to figure out how do we get the story moved forward from what's happening in the Roman Empire and when the Roman Empire ceases to be the dominant idea in everyone's mind to the whatever new reality is going to follow, and how that ultimately transitions to modern Europe. And so I was trying to tell this tale well for a variety of countries, so we could track, okay, this is how we wind up with something like France and Germany and Spain and these sorts of things. But we always had special interest in the British Isles because that's our own most recent ancestry as Americans, who are the majority of folks using the books are in English after all, right? So there you go. And as I was sort of pushing the story back, and I knew I wanted to do something with Arthur because I knew that he was so important to, it's not just about telling the history of why is there a place called Britain. it's also telling the history of why are there people who identify as being British
Yeah.
and English, and what's the difference between that, and how does all that stuff work together? And of course, Arthur is an important part of that story, because Arthur comes up right at this juncture where the Britons, who've had a rough time of it, they've been, beaten down on by all these invaders, and the Romans come in and the Romans conquer them, and then the Romans become their protectors, and then the Roman legions pull out, and the Britons are like, now what do we do? This, and they're kind of exposed, and they
Yeah.
decide, well, we need to bring in another outside people who are strong in war to protect us, and they call upon the Saxons.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
Saxons bring with them the Angles and the Jutes, and they come over and they show up, and they do fight off the Scots and whatnot, and they say, wow, this is a really great land. We really love your land. And the Britons say, thank you. That's so kind. And they say, no, you don't understand. We love your land. And so we're going to stick around and make it our land. And of course, the Britons are not really the whole reason these guys were hired, these mercenaries from outside, was to do the fighting on the behalf of the British. I almost said us. And it's so there's not really a lot of native strength to resist them. But what winds up happening is kind of against all hope, this hero rises up and wins this. The British win this battle that takes place sometime near the end of the 5th century, very end of the 5th century, or very beginning of the 6th century, the Battle of Badon Hill. And that battle, the first account of it we have is from a man called Gildas, who writes his text called On the Destruction and Conquest of Britain. It comes out sometime in the 540s. And Gildas says that he was born in the year this battle took place. So he's looking back on this as this is kind of the story of his people at this time. By the time he's writing this book, it's called The Destruction and Conquest of Britain, because the Anglo-Saxon forces have resurged and completed the conquest. But there was this one moment at the end of the 5th century when a man whom he names as Ambrosius Aurelianus rises up in battle and leads the British against the Saxons and beats them and halts the Saxon conquest for about 30 years or so before they reassert themselves and finish it off. This figure is going to become, over the next couple of centuries, invisibly in ways that we can't exactly track, is going to become the ground actually both of Arthur and of Merlin. And then the next time we see this story pop up, the name has been changed to Arthur, and then these Welsh tales start to come up, and this identity start to be built. And so that really grabbed my attention about this period of transition. Jump in there, Malcolm.
Yeah, no, it's great. So just to really clarify again for everybody, nowadays people sometimes use the word British and English interchangeably. So in modern times, British means the whole British Isles, and English means England. However, in the period that you're talking about, at the end of the 5th century, we didn't have we now think of a Celtic fringe, right? The Celts are in Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, Ireland, a little bit down in Brittany. And it's called the Celtic fringe. But before the Anglo-Saxons showed up, it wasn't we were all Celts.
That's right.
All they were different. So, and the Celts called themselves Britons. And they even had a kind of cool story that they told about themselves, that the name, which Geoffrey of Monmouth tells, that the name Britain goes back to some hero from the Trojan Wars called Brutus, who kind of comes to us just like Aeneid went for the Romans. Anyway, it's neither here nor there. So Arthur is a British king. And the sources of Arthur, as you've said, Gildas, the earliest ones are Latin and Welsh. Then we get some French sources, because here's the thing. When the Normans invaded and beat the Saxons in 1066.
Payback.
They didn't. I hate that. Yeah, I still haven't recovered. But the good thing that came out of that was that they needed to have some sense of connectedness and rootedness and ancient tales of the land. But they didn't want to talk about Alfred the Great, who was the obvious example of a great Anglo-Saxon king. They needed somebody else who had also beaten the Saxons, and that was Arthur. So they loved these stories, and there's a kind of almost like a bridge back. But this is what gives me great hope, and I mentioned this in the second room. When my Anglo-Saxon ancestors came to the shores of this land, they were the invaders, they were unwelcome, and they were fighting the likes of King Arthur. And they were pagan, and Arthur was kind of Romano-Christian. So Arthur was Christian and really had a sense of what the cross was. That's why the Grail stories are so important. Now, the amazing thing is that within a generation of that Arthurian period Celts are converting Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxons and Celts are actually worshipping in the same churches. Eventually, they figure out how to mix and match that at the Synod of Whitby in the 7th century, 665. And so the English became part of the British Isles story. And then they got to the point by the 13th or 14th century where they heard these stories about the Welsh king who would have been the enemy of their ancestors,
Right.
and went, no, we want a bit of this.
That's right.
And they were able to have and develop these different, ethnically different, linguistically different, previously fighting peoples, all came to love and accept and grow through and from a common legendary heritage. And eventually you get the masterpiece of Mallory written in High Middle English. And so I've got a bit in the second volume where Arthur's getting really exercised and hot under the core about these bloody Saxons, and is starting to say some bigoted things about Anglo-Saxons, which is very easy to do, But Merlin says, I'm going to prophesy to you. The descendants of those you're fighting now will love you and know your name. One day, an English poet will write a poem about you. So God has a place for the English too. But given all that background, I'm very much trying to seize this poem back from the sort of xenophobic bigots who like to just take it and use it as a kind of flag-waving, bash the enemy kind of process. If you take the long story, which is Joseph of Arimathea arriving with the Grail and the spear, the whole thing starts with a little boatload of refugees from the Middle East. And then it passes between at least 5 different races, all of whom end up honoring the same name. So it is diverse, it's multicultural, it's definitely multilinguistic. And I'm trying to write it in such a way that I don't get these bigots saying, oh, Arthur's always been for the English, and anybody that, hasn't got the same skin color as an Englishman is somehow an enemy, Because in Parzival, in the High German version of it, there's a knight who's come from Islam, and there's a guy called Palamedes who converts. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on there.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And that's part of what grabbed my attention as I was going over this story again. It had been a long time since I'd spent time with this, and I'd never done the work of saying, how do I, using only contemporary sources, and I'll tell the story, essentially allowed them to tell the story themselves. So I saw myself more curating the tale than telling the tale. And it became clear just how exciting and pivotal Arthur was, because, as you say, it's, he becomes, his story is so compelling that the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, everyone keeps getting folded into it. And it's almost what it means to be British today, is to be able to read yourself into that story.
Exactly. So it's a story for all the Britons of today, wherever they've come from and, whatever their ethnicity. And in fact, in its heyday in the 12th and 13th century, it was a story for the whole of Europe. Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach. And one of my favorite bits in Dante, in Canto 6 of the Inferno, when you get the tragic story of Paolo and Francesca, it all starts with the two of them reading about Lancelot and Guinevere.
That's right.
So even Dante wants a bit of Arthurian action.
That's right.
Well, Malcolm, what about how do Americans fit into this? Do we have anything?
Well, I think first of all, I think it's a poem for the whole English-speaking world.
Yeah.
And I think obviously a lot of Americans feel an ancestral pull, but it doesn't have to be a bloodline ancestral pull.
Sure.
It's a cultural ancestral pull. If you've grown up with English poetry, then Arthur is yours, because, one of my ways back into Arthur was reading Keats's La Belle Dame sans Merci. What can ail thee, night at arms alone and palely loitering, the sedges withered from the lake and no birds sing. It's that enchanted world again. Or Tennyson, on either side the river lie long fields of barley and rather, the Lady of Shalott. So, and of course then the great Idylls of the King. So it's part of the poetic inheritance of the English-speaking world. And obviously Americans and Canadians are a large part of the English-speaking world. And of course there have been some very interesting American takes on it. I mean, a Connecticut Yankee in the court of King Arthur, interesting case. Because in a sense, I think Mark Twain starts off trying to take the mickey, as we would say. He's sophisticated, no-nonsense Yankee to send up these tomfoolery people galloping about and hitting each other with lances. What is that about?
Yeah.
And he's trying to teach them how to have a proper democracy and a republic. But gradually, if you may remember in the course of that story, he kind of grudgingly realizes they've got something he hasn't got.
Yeah.
And so that's quite interesting dramatization of the complex American response to these stories.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Americans, Junius, an American, a great American, Junius Johnson. Tell me about this class you've got coming up. I want to give you a chance to talk about that before we wrap up here in a few minutes.
Yeah. So the result of getting back into all this stuff again and seeing just how much sense it made of everything and being reminded of how rich this story is and how the power that it has to allow anyone, regardless of the people you belong to find themselves in it, to discover themselves in it, to realize that it was always your story, even if it seemed like it was your enemy's story. All these wonderful things Malcolm's saying so well. When I realized that, I thought, okay, we need to come back to this then, because there's a great, I'm a historical theologian and I'm a historical philosopher and I love the Middle Ages and these other sorts of things, and so I'm very aware of all the ways in which. To take a bit from Peter Jackson's version of Tolkien, right? Some things which should not have been forgotten were forgotten. And there's always a cost, not just culturally, but even personally, when we forget these things that are so formative of who we are and that are still shaping and affecting how we do things like love. My sense of romance, which caused me no end of trouble throughout my life, was deeply shaped by these stories. And so I thought, okay, I want to find a way to get people back into this material. And I want, again, to let the past speak for itself as much as I can. So I conceived of this massive sweep of teaching, whereby I would offer 2 courses in successive years, so January to May of 2026 and January to May of 2027, meeting once a week, where we would just read the tradition. And so in this first year coming up, we're going to start with Gildas, and we're going to read the early historians, and we're going to read the Mabinogi and the early Welsh sources, and just see where did this come from and how did this first develop, and we'll follow it all the way through the high French romances, which give us the notions of Camelot, the Quest of the Grail, give us Lancelot, give us Guinevere, all of that kind of stuff. And then in 2027, we're going to hop over to the English tradition, and we're going to read Mallory, and we're going to follow it then from there through Tennyson and T.H. White to see what's been made of it subsequently, with the idea of taking it over again.
Piece. I mean, it'd be great for readers of my books as they come out in 26 and 27 to be doing your course as well. It'll give them a lot of great background and insight into whatever. By the way, when you're saying that this is really about remembering something that should never have been forgotten, you're in very good company there, Junius. This is what Susanna Clarke kindly wrote a preface to this book. And she says, the Arthurian legends always want to call us back to something in danger of being forgotten. Whatever Camelot and the knights represent to us, it will be against the grain of the prevailing culture. In the Galahad and the Grail, the quest of the Grail is a journey into Christian mysticism. Malcolm Guite doesn't trouble to water down his hermits, ladies, knights, and king to meet the 21st century's tastes. These men and women are all entirely lacking in cynicism and take it for granted that the most splendid thing they can do is to try to live their lives according to an impossible ideal, whether you call that ideal chivalry or an imitation of Christ. I thought, you've got totally what I'm doing here. Thank you.
It's so good.
Yeah. Well, Malcolm Guite and Junius Johnson, thank you both for helping us remember things that should have never been forgotten. So, I'm so excited about your.
I think it's a bit of a
poem,
kind of movement of the spirit that Junius and I, over the same arc of the same years, are coming to the same material with our complementary ways of doing it.
It really is, because I knew in the past that you were working on this, but I'd completely forgotten it. I was just following my own excitement about sharing these stories with other people, and you sent me an email and said, "Oh, right, I've got these books coming out," and I was like, "Wow, what a coincidence!" So really the spirit's working.
Your books will complement mine, but also my book will give people another way of, a new way of handling the material that you've given them. See what is being done with it now.
That's right.
Yeah. Junius, I'm excited to see what comes of these classes, these courses you've put together. So thanks for your work too, Junius.
Thank you for having us and hosting this conversation. It's been delightful.
Thanks for being here. It certainly has been. Thanks. The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.